Thank you all for coming to hear my talk. My latest book is this one here, which has just arrived. They had them shipped to Raj, and he brought them. The Mystery of the Katyn Massacre, The Evidence, the Solution. So I want to give a little introduction to just what the Katyn Massacre is. Now, is there anybody here who's not too clear about just what we're talking about the Katyn Massacre? I think a number of people probably aren't. So let me just give a brief introduction to what it is, and then I'll get to my talk, okay? In Europe, for whatever reason, Katyn is better known, and we'll get into that. But let me just give you a very brief introduction to just what we're talking about here. In April 1943, Nazi German authorities claimed that they had discovered thousands of bodies of Polish officers shot by Soviet officials in 1940. Now remember, the Germans and Allies invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, right? But taking a step back, Germany and Poland went to war on September the 1st, 1939. Okay? So, what happened when Germany invaded Poland was that the Polish army was defeated very quickly. The Soviet Union sent the army in to occupy Western Belarus and Western Ukraine. These were areas which belonged to Poland because Poland had seized them from the Russian Socialist Republic in 1920 to 1921. The Soviet Union itself wasn't formed until 1923. So they had been part of Russia, but Poland had invaded Russia and seized these two areas and incorporated them into Poland. This is, by anti-communists, often called an invasion of the Soviet Union of Poland. But in fact, the Polish state had ceased to exist, and the Soviets were simply taking back these territories that had been lost in 1920. I go into all of that story in this book, Blood Lies. But just to set the stage so you know what we're talking about, right? In the process of entering and taking over Western Ukraine and Western Belarus back from Poland and keeping the German armies 300 or 400 kilometers away from the 1939 border of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union took a lot of Polish army prisoners. Okay? The Polish army was there. They had been driven from the west further and further east, and this was the far eastern parts of Poland. In April 1943, German Nazi authorities claimed that they had discovered thousands of bodies of Polish officers shot by Soviet officials in 1940, before the Nazi invasion, right? These bodies were said to have been discovered near the Katyn forest, near Smolensk in western Russia, which is why the whole affair, including executions and alleged executions of Polish prisoners of war elsewhere in the Soviet Union, came to be called the Katyn Massacre. Okay, although not all of whatever happened right there at Katyn, outside Smolensk. So what happened subsequently is the Germans and the Polish government in exile sent representatives. The Polish representatives blamed the Soviet Union for killing these 14 to 22,000 Polish POWs. In 1943, later in 1943, the Soviet Red Army recaptured this area. In 1944, a Soviet report was prepared and made where the Soviets blamed the Germans for killing all these Poles. Okay? As a result of the Cold War, the Western former allies, all of the anti-communist forces, adopted the German Polish nationalist version of the story as the truth, namely that the Soviets had murdered all these people. The Soviet Union continued to deny this until 1989, when Gorbachev decided he was going to tell to reveal to the Poles and to everybody else that Stalin and company had really shot these people. In 1991, Gorbachev presented some documents to Yeltsin, who was about to become the president of Russia, right? The Soviet Union was dissolving. Yeltsin in 1992 presented the documents to Lech Walesa, who has become the president of capitalist Poland. And ever since then, this has been the official viewpoint, okay? That the Soviets killed, Stalin and company killed all these Poles. Now, let me start my talk, okay? More detail will sort of emerge, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knew basically what event we're talking about. Why another book on the Katyn Massacre? And particularly, why call it a mystery? Right? My book is called The Mystery of the Katyn Massacre. The world at large believes that the mystery, if there ever really was one, was solved long ago in the early 1990s when the Soviet and then the Russian governments admitted guilt and produced the smoking gun documents of closed packet number 1, the primary source evidence of Soviet guilt in that atrocity. I used to think the same thing myself. When I read in the New York Times that President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union had admitted the guilt of the Stalin government at Katyn, I had no cause to doubt it. We're talking 1990. The revelation in the same newspaper a couple of years later that President Yeltsin of Russia had given these smoking gun documents to Lech Walesa, president of Poland, confirmed what I already thought. But since the mid-1990s, there has appeared research claiming that this is all wrong, that Katyn is a frame-up, anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, and anti-communist. I was intrigued. Katyn was now a mystery, and I like mysteries. But there was more to my attraction to Katyn than that. I, in my student days, became involved in the protest movement against the American war in Vietnam. I sympathized with the Vietnamese struggle for independence. I learned that anti-communism was not exactly a fraud. The United States government was genuinely anti-communist. But that anti-communism also served as camouflage for imperialism and for ordinary capitalist exploitation. France, then Japan, and then the United States had dominated Vietnam. For France and the United States, anti-communism became the rationale for a war to preserve empire. In Vietnam and around the world, it was the communists who were the major force organizing opposition to this imperialist war by the United States. At a huge anti-war demonstration in Manhattan in 1967, someone told me in a friendly manner that I should not oppose the U.S. war in Vietnam. Why not, I asked. Because the other side, the National Liberation Front, was led by the Vietnamese Communist Party, which was led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had been trained by Joseph Stalin, and Stalin, he said, had murdered 40 million people. So you get the idea, right? You oppose the American war in Vietnam, and you're on the slippery slope to murdering millions of people. Okay. I did not either believe or disbelieve what he said, but I determined that I would look into this matter seriously once I had the time. I was confident that I possessed the tools to do this. I could read Russian, German, and French. Studying Polish was to come later. I also knew that to do valid historical research, the student must identify, locate, obtain, study, and draw the correct conclusions from primary sources. I had learned that in graduate school, where I studied medieval comparative literature, and I teach medieval literature as my profession at university. My professors insisted on the vital importance of primary source evidence. They taught us never to be afraid to question, and in fact to challenge, the prevailing orthodoxy within the field, no matter how monolithic, how indestructible it appeared to be, if the primary source evidence demanded it. I also embarked on the study of Soviet history as a project in self-clarification. I had questions about the Stalin period in the Soviet Union that challenged my opposition to the Vietnam War, to American imperialism, and to the conventionally accepted Cold War paradigm of understanding history and politics. I had the tools, I had a little courage, learned perhaps from my participation in the anti-war movement, so I began to research the Stalin years. By 2006, I had read enough on Katyn to know that there was a critical mass of research that rejected what I call the official version of Katyn, that the Soviets were guilty. So I created a web page to which I gave the irreverent title, The Katyn Forest Whodunit. At that time, it was the only resource in the English language where one could learn about the research that challenged the official version. But I did not endorse either version, either the official Soviets did it version or the oppositional Germans did it, Soviets were framed version. I remained agnostic about Katyn. In January 2013, I learned about excavations of a mass murder site in Volodymyr-Volynski, Ukraine, by a joint Polish-Ukrainian archaeological team. I found the Polish archaeologists' report online and studied it. I recognized the importance of the discoveries made there for any objective understanding of Katyn. I set about doing some intensive study. I found a journal, Socialism and Democracy, willing to accept an article, which was published in August 2013. The title of my article is, quote, "The official version of the Katyn Massacre disproven? Question mark. Discoveries at a German mass murder site in Ukraine." During the next 18 months, I printed up several hundred offprints of this article and mailed them around the world. After 18 months, I put a link to that article on my homepage. Before publication, my very helpful editor asked me, why the quotation mark? Why the question mark? In truth, I did not know why, except that it felt right. Once the article was published, I concentrated on mailing offprints and on researching and writing another book. I was very busy, but that question nagged at me. Why had I put that question mark there, right? Just to remind you, the title of my article was The Official Version of the Katyn Massacre Disproven, question mark, right? At length I realized that I was still not fully convinced myself that the official version of Katyn had indeed been disproven. As much as I knew about Katyn, I still did not know enough. When a detective sets out to solve a mystery, he or she doesn't care who's guilty. The detective approaches the task of solving the crime objectively. In The Adventure of the Red Circle, we find the following exchange between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. "It is art for art's sake, Watson," says Holmes. "I suppose when you doctored, you found yourself studying cases without thought of a fee?" "For my education, Holmes." "Education never ends, Watson. It is a series of lessons with the greatest for the last. This is an instructive case. There is neither money nor credit in it, and yet one would wish to tidy it up." Holmes's words precisely expressed my deeper motive in researching and writing this book. For there is neither money nor credit in it. On the contrary, I can be assured that I will be attacked and slandered by those who are horrified to look the truth in the face and discover that it is not at all what they want it to be. Yet, one would wish to tidy it up, to solve the mystery. To solve any mystery, we must first identify the relevant evidence. And concerning Katyn, there is a mountain of material that is often taken to be evidence. Maria Konnikova explains, quote, "In other words, there is too much information to begin with, too many details to be able to start making them into any sort of coherent whole, separating the crucial from the incidental. When so many facts are piled together, the task becomes increasingly problematic. You have a vast quantity of your own observations and data, but also an even vaster quantity of potentially incorrect information from individuals who may not have observed as mindfully as you have. That is the situation that faces us in the case of Katyn." Holmes concludes, quote, "The difficulty is to detach the framework of fact, of absolute, undeniable fact, from the embellishments of theorists and reporters. Then, having established ourselves upon this sound basis, it is our duty to see what inferences may be drawn and what are the special points upon which the whole mystery turns. As it happens, this is a good succinct outline of the proper method of doing historical research too." A bigger problem is objectivity. Very few of the persons involved in studying Katyn are objective. They have decided that the official version is correct, that the Soviets killed the Polish POWs, and that there is no doubt remaining about this. Moreover, they have decided that it is perverse to even raise the question, that simply to approach Katyn as a mystery implies that the solution has not been definitively determined for all time, and is therefore a dishonest thing to do, since it implies the possibility that the Soviets might not have done it. This state of affairs has discouraged objective study of Katyn, as it is no doubt intended to do. So I undertook to solve the Katyn mystery more for self-clarification than for any other reason. Can I apply my own principles? Am I capable of approaching this important topic with objectivity? Can I look with a special suspicion on all evidence that tends to support my preconceived ideas, while giving an especially generous reading to evidence that tends to contradict my own ideas? If the evidence demands it, am I capable of concluding that Stalin and the Soviet leadership did indeed kill the Polish POWs, as the official version states? Yes, I am. I am much more interested in the mystery itself than in what the solution might be. Besides, it is more satisfying to demand objectivity of oneself than to take the coward's way out and either decide for the stronger side and thus win a dishonest approbation, or to assert the unpopular side out of bias and prejudice, and thus know in my own mind at least that I am afraid to face the truth. I agree with historian Jeffrey Roberts when he says, quote, "I should make it clear that as a historian, I have a strong orientation to telling the truth about the past, no matter how uncomfortable or unpalatable the conclusions may be. I don't think there is a dilemma. You just tell the truth as you see it." My research concludes that the Germans, not the Soviets, are guilty of the mass murders known as the Katyn Massacre. This is the same conclusion as is drawn by a few Russian researchers, including the late Sergei Strygin, Vladislav Shved, Valentin Sakharov, Yelena Prudnikova, and Ivan Chigirin. But I have not followed the method that these researchers have used. Instead, I have used the method that a detective would employ. A detective who did not care who was guilty, but whose aim was solely to find out the truth and report the truth and let the chips fall where they may. By that time, I had been studying Katyn for years. I knew that there are only a few documents that constitute the primary source evidence in this case. Once I began to systematically sort, categorize, and study this evidence, I realized that there are only a few bits of evidence that cannot possibly have been fabricated or falsified in order to bias the case in favor of one or the other version. So in this study, I concentrate on these few bits of what I call, quote, unimpeachable evidence, meaning evidence that it is impossible to discredit as evidence, although, of course, the interpretation is something else. This book is written for the student of history who wants to know the truth, even when that truth is disillusioning, in that it forces her to set aside her own illusions, her preconceived ideas, and actually change her mind. Researching and writing this book has changed my mind. I am no longer agnostic on the subject of Katyn. I predict that those who have built their professional careers around the official version of Katyn, which, remember, the official version is the Soviets did it, it's a sure thing, and it's perverse to even ask the question, who did it? So I predict that those who have built their professional careers around the official version of Katyn will, as a matter of course, reject the conclusions of this research. They will reject it for a priori reasons. They are biased, unalterably prejudiced in favor of the view that the Soviets are guilty. No amount of evidence will change their minds. Before a juror can be seated on a jury in a criminal trial in the United States, that juror is instructed, or should be instructed, that he or she must decide the guilt or innocence of the accused strictly on the basis of evidence, not according to any preconceived idea or bias. Historians, too, are professionally obliged to act in this way. Unfortunately, not a single one of those who have studied Katyn can honestly claim that they have adhered to this vital principle. Not a single one except myself. This book may also not please those students of history who are convinced that the Soviets were innocent of Katyn, but think that this can be established by means that, in my judgment, are not valid. For example, by attempting to prove, through internal analysis, that the documents of closed packet number 1 are forgeries. Another approach must be taken. I believe it is the one I have adopted here. I expect sharp attacks from defenders of the official viewpoint. After all, they are not interested in the truth. In reality, they are not really interested in the Polish POWs who were killed at Katyn. For if they were, they would welcome the discovery of who the real culprits, the real mass murderers were. Instead, they are interested only in how the notion of Soviet guilt at Katyn can be used today to justify their own political, historical, and cultural projects. Despite the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on memorials, conferences, books, articles, educational materials, and indoctrination of all kinds, all the Polish and Russian governments of today care about is their own political agendas. The mystery of Katyn has both intrigued and challenged me for years. That is the reason I have done this research and written this book. Of course, it does give appropriate respect to the victims of a murder to identify the guilty party after many years and bring closure, as is often said. However, in time, the relatives and friends of the Katyn victims will pass from the scene, as all of us will. What will remain is the historical event. Now we know what happened and what did not happen, who is guilty and who is not. I would like to briefly describe to you the method I used to solve the mystery of the Katyn Massacre. Let's begin with the principle of objectivity. Objectivity is an attitude of distrust of the self. You must firmly decide from the very beginning of your investigation that you will take definite measures to counteract whatever bias you have. Sherlock Holmes took cases that he knew nothing about, and so he did not care whom he would find to be guilty. So did Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, for example, in the famous book The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, where the guilty party turns out to be both Poirot's assistant and the narrator of the novel. Poirot is objective and solves the murder despite his close association with the murderer. I knew that I would never solve this mystery unless I set my own biases aside, and I did so. An enormous number of books and articles have been written on Katyn. Most of this material is, strictly speaking, irrelevant to the question of who done it. It is noise that has to be discarded. I decided the only true path to a solution of this crime was to find evidence that could not possibly have been faked. I call this the unimpeachable evidence. There are basically two kinds of evidence that fit this criteria. One, evidence that goes against the bias of those who produce the evidence. For example, the Germans admitted in 1943 that only German shell casings were found together with the bodies of the murdered Polish officers. The Germans would never have deliberately planted those German shell casings. Therefore, this evidence could not have been faked. Two, evidence whose significance for the case the party which discovered it failed to understand and so never used. There are only four sources of primary source evidence for Katyn: the German report of 1943, the Soviet Burdenko Commission report of January 1944, closed packet number 1, the documents Gorbachev gave to Yeltsin in December 1991, claiming they had just been located in Soviet archives, and facsimiles of which Yeltsin gave to Polish President Lech Walesa in 1992, and the Polish report of the discoveries in the mass graves at Volodymyr Volynski, Ukraine, in 2010 to 2012. There are no other sources of primary source evidence concerning the question of who murdered the Polish POWs. There are indeed several thousand pages of published documents, mainly in Russian, but some in Polish. For the researcher detective, they are a distraction, a red herring. But you can only know this if you have spent serious time, in my case over a period of 10 years, studying Katyn. Also, you have to be able to read German, Russian, and Polish, and French doesn't hurt either. The unimpeachable evidence, the evidence that cannot have been faked, has to reveal the truth. Sure, there's other evidence that contradicts it, but it's dubious for one reason or another. There are strong suspicions that some of it has been forged. Some of it must have been forged. But which? There's no way to know for sure unless you first solve the mystery. And you can't use this dubious material to solve the mystery. My study of the unimpeachable evidence takes up the first 100 pages of this book. This is the book. This is the solving the mystery part. If this were really a detective story, that would be it. The mystery is solved, the end. But of course, there's more. In the case of Katyn, my conclusion contradicts all the mainstream scholarship, the official version. In the real world, where anti-Stalinists and anti-communists have all the power, it is taboo to question this official version. We are told that, quote, this is what I've been told, only communists, dishonest people, and kooks, end quote, question this official version, which is that the Soviets were guilty. Denying that is compared to denying the Holocaust. It is morally unacceptable in mainstream discussion to question the official version that Stalin et al. Murdered the Poles. There are many aspects of the Katyn Massacre issue that I do not explore in this book. That's because I concentrate on two things. First, solve the mystery. Discover who murdered the Poles. Second, keep the book short. I have discovered that most people will not read books that are more than about 299 pages long. Once you hear that, once you see that word 3, most people just, oh no, this is not for me, you know? Too long. It's okay, so this book is 260 pages long, okay? You could write a lot more, but I don't. Here I want to mention one facet of this mystery that I discovered, but didn't put in the book, because it isn't directly relevant to solving the mystery. It concerns Nikita Khrushchev. I've written a whole book on Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress. That's this one here, Khrushchev Lied, okay? In which Khrushchev accused Stalin and Lavrentiy Beria of many serious crimes. Khrushchev lied. Khrushchev lied. We can prove that Stalin did not commit those crimes. That's what I do in the book. In most cases, we can prove that Khrushchev knew he was lying. I've also written a bit about Khrushchev's even more virulent attack on Stalin at the 22nd Party Congress in October 1961. Khrushchev tried to blame Stalin for a great many crimes that Stalin never committed. So, why didn't he try to blame Stalin for Katyn? If, in fact, Stalin and his closest associates were guilty of murdering the Polish prisoners, that evidence must have existed in Khrushchev's time, just as it supposedly existed in Gorbachev's day. Well, it seems that Khrushchev did try. Several of the documents in closed packet number 1 were created during Khrushchev's era. One of them shows unmistakable signs of forgery. We know that Alexander Shelepin, a Khrushchev loyalist who was head of the KGB for a few years, saw this document and some others and believed them. Shelepin believed that the Soviets really had killed the Poles. But for some reason, Khrushchev decided not to go through with the plan to blame Stalin for Katyn. 25 years later, Gorbachev resumed the conspiracy to blame Stalin and carried it off, using some of the documents forged for Khrushchev and having some new ones forged for himself. Okay, back to our mystery. Stalin and the Soviets could not possibly have murdered the Polish POWs. For how could they be guilty when all the unimpeachable evidence, all the evidence that cannot possibly have been faked, points away from Soviet guilt? It's impossible. The unimpeachable evidence has to be decisive. But this will be the argument of those people who have the preconceived ideas that the Soviets must be guilty. A great many people including the entire academic establishment and all the anti-communist governments around the world, want the Soviets to be the guilty party at Katyn. Yet another German atrocity is just not politically useful. But the story of Soviet guilt is useful in condemning Stalin and, by extension, communism itself. These people are not interested in the truth. Right-wing Polish nationalism is built upon the myth of Polish victimhood, not only at the hands of the Nazis, but also at the hands of the Soviet Union and Polish communists. Several generations of anti-communist academics have built their reputations upon the false foundation of Soviet guilt at Katyn. Katyn is, in fact, the, quote, this is my quotes, best documented crime of Stalin, end quote. If Katyn is removed as a, quote, crime of Stalin, what, quote, crimes will remain to blame Stalin with? If it becomes widely known that Katyn was fraudulently blamed on Stalin, people will begin to wonder, what else is Stalin falsely accused of? And then what will be left to uphold the Stalin boogeyman, the main form of anti-communism in the world today? In my book, I examine in detail all the collections of documents, plus both of the now authoritative scholarly studies of Katyn. I show how the German report of 1943, the closed packet number 1 of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and other important books and studies that promote the Soviets' version of Katyn are falsified, sometimes cleverly, but often in a shoddy manner. I also study the so-called Ukrainian trail of Katyn. In 1994, Polish researchers claimed that they had discovered documentary evidence of victims of Katyn who, according to the documents in closed packet number 1, were captured in the Ukraine. My research proves that this is all wrong. These documents have no relation to the Katyn Massacre. Naturally, because the massacre did not take place in April-May 1940, as the anti-communist and official version states, but in the late summer or fall of 1941, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union that began on June 22nd, 1941. That reminds me, let me just give you an example of how firmly fixed this notion of Soviet guilt at Katyn is. Okay? So, I wrote this book and I have the manuscript and I want to get a Library of Congress number. All right? Those of you who know libraries know that the Library of Congress number is the way that most libraries these days are organized. Okay? And they have descriptors, Library of Congress subject headings that go along with the number, right? So, the Library of Congress subject headings, there's a lot of them, but they're fixed. You can't change them, okay? The Library of Congress has established them. They're used for cataloging purposes, right? So, the first subject heading here is Katyn Massacre, Katyn, Russia, 1940. That's a Library of Congress subject heading. My research shows that it didn't happen in 1940, right? That's the Soviets did it version. That it actually must have happened in 1941 when the Germans did it. So I talked to my she's not mine, she's the cataloging librarian at my university. A good friend of mine, a union activist, a very fair-minded person, Mei Ling Chow. I said, Mei Ling, I need a new Library of Congress subject heading. It says 1940 and that's not right. And she looked into it. She said, I'm sorry. This is the Library of Congress subject heading. It can't be changed. Okay? The Library of Congress subject heading says Katyn took place in 1940. You've got to list it under Katyn Massacre 1940, even though it took place in 1941. Okay? That's how firmly established the idea that the Soviets did it has been fixed. Okay? That it's built into the Library of Congress as cataloging system, right? And so I had to put it in. Just so you know, you can read all the analysis of the primary and secondary documents in my book. Obviously, I can't go over all that in the talk. And you should. Why should you? Okay, first saying everybody should read my book. Oh, come on, man. What do you mean we should read your book? We've got other things to do. All right. Here's why you should. Here's why you should. This is the most interesting, the fun part of any mystery story. How does the detective, Sherlock Furr, okay? How does the detective solve the mystery? What evidence does he examine? How does he examine it? How does he arrive at a hypothesis, a chain of reasoning that will make a logical and accurate pattern out of the evidence? This is why we read these detective stories, right? Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes, all that stuff, right? That's the interesting thing. That's why you should read it. How does he decide what evidence not to use? Remember in the Sherlock Holmes short story Silver Blaze, the dog that didn't bark, right? What happened to the dog in the nighttime? The dog did nothing in the nighttime. That was the curious incident, right? There's stuff like that in this mystery too. Okay? Evidence not to use. What materials that, while appearing to be evidence, are really noise, irrelevant, serving only to confuse and misdirect the detective until he discards it and leaves only the real evidence. Solving the mystery of the Katyn Massacre was a challenge. I had to find some rare sources in 3 foreign languages and study them closely, actually 4. Solving the case was very gratifying. When I set out on this quest to do this research, I did not know whether I'd be able to definitively solve the mystery or not. A book that studied all the evidence and then concluded that the mystery could not be solved or not definitively solved, like, say, the Jack the Ripper killings of 1888, right? Or the Black Dahlia murder in Los Angeles of 1947. That kind of book would be interesting, all right, but not nearly as important as one that solved the mystery. I also thought that I might well discover that Stalin and the Soviets were guilty after all. So why should you or anybody care? You should care because the Katyn Massacre is universally believed to be a terrible crime of Stalin, the best documented crime of Stalin, and it's a fraud. Stalin and the Soviets did not kill the Poles. That is excluded by the unimpeachable evidence. Stalin cannot possibly be guilty. The Nazis began this fraud sometime around March 1943. After the Soviet victory at Stalingrad on February 2nd, 1943, everybody knew that Germany would eventually lose the war. Hitler's only hope was to split the Allies. Then maybe he could make a separate peace with the West. Maybe he could even convince the West to join with Nazi Germany in attacking the Soviet Union. Right away, the Nazis got a big assist from the Polish government in exile, which was in London, and their underground army in occupied Poland, the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa. The Polish government in exile agreed to collaborate with the Nazis and lend their prestige to the Nazi story. They did this despite the fact that they had only the Nazis' word that the Soviets had killed the Poles, and despite the fact that the Nazis were murdering millions of Poles and destroying much of Poland. The Polish government in exile was far more anti-communist than anti-German. In fact, the pre-war Polish government had wanted to ally with Hitler against the Soviet Union. But Hitler had other plans. Since the Cold War began in the 1940s, all anti-communist forces have insisted that the Soviets were guilty at Katyn. In 1989, when Gorbachev first claimed that his men had discovered the evidence that the Soviets had indeed been guilty, he was lying. He had no such evidence at that time. In my previous books, okay, and I have a flyer here about all the different books which I'm going to hand out to you. In my previous books, I have discovered and exposed the following anti-Stalin lies. Khrushchev's secret speech is all false. The Khrushchev-Gorbachev story that the murderer of Leningrad Party leader Sergei Kirov in December 1934 was a lone gunman, and that Stalin framed all of those later accused and convicted of complicity in this murder. That's a fraud. The accusations made by Yale professor Timothy Snyder in his prize-winning book Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, that Stalin had committed dozens of crimes and atrocities, all Snyder's accusations are completely false. Leon Trotsky's claims that he and his followers did not engage in sabotage inside the Soviet Union, Trotsky's amalgams, and Trotsky's denial that he had collaborated with the Germans and Japanese, all those claims by Trotsky are false. That Stalin ordered the massive killings during 1937 to 38, that the anti-communists called the Great Terror and the Russians often called the Yezhovshchina, that too is false. Okay. I am now completing a book, and I basically completed it, but I have to do some revisions. I am now completing a book in which I examine Volume 2 of Princeton professor Stephen Kotkin's projected 3-volume biography of Stalin. This guy's a very well-known professor at Princeton University. Okay, Stephen Kotkin. Volume 2 of this projected 3-volume work came out in October. It is titled Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1928 to 1941. This book is 1,154 pages long, with 909 pages of text, 160 pages of triple-columned footnotes in tiny print. I have to read them with a magnifying glass. Literally. I mean, I see most of you are not young anymore. You'd have to read it with a magnifying glass, too. And 47 pages of bibliography, also in triple columns and tiny print. Unlike Timothy Snyder, the guy whose book I refute here, Kotkin has specialized in Soviet history of the Stalin period for his whole professional life. Right? This is his thing, Stalin. Somewhat to my surprise, I have discovered that, despite 30 years of study and all of his efforts, Kotkin, too, has been unable to discover one single genuine crime by Stalin, and so has had to fabricate and falsify. Once my book has been published, perhaps within the next 8 months or so, I hope to speak to you about it. Meanwhile, what remains to be said about the Katyn issue is this. It has been a fraud from the very beginning. Here are just a few incidents. The Germans never had any evidence worth speaking of that the Soviets had killed the Poles. Of course, because they had done it themselves. The Polish Red Cross and Polish government representatives arrived already determined to convict the Soviets of the crime. We know that because the Germans had no reasonable evidence to show them. We know that because the Germans published their report in the summer of 1943, and we can read it, and there's no reasonable evidence in it, and I study that report in my book. There are a lot of flaws in the German report, which remains the single most important document for the official view that the Soviets were guilty. These flaws were uncovered very early on, right after the war. But once the Cold War began in earnest, no one mentioned them anymore. During the Cold War, only the Polish exile version, the version that says the Soviets killed the Poles, only that version got any publicity. Once Khrushchev attacked Stalin in 1956, the Soviets, under Khrushchev and after him, did very little to counter the Nazi Polish version, which was now the official anti-communist Cold War version. As I mentioned, Khrushchev was contemplating a campaign to frame Stalin for Katyn, but did not go through with it. Therefore, it is quite possible that Gorbachev and his men actually believed that Stalin had had the Polish POWs murdered. Gorbachev is not a bright guy. Why did Gorbachev decide to frame Stalin for Katyn? He thought this would improve relations with Poland, which by the late 1980s had become increasingly hostile to the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev and his associates probably believed it too, even though they had no evidence. Eventually, the Gorbachev regime organized a forgery team to create documents to frame Stalin and the Politburo. These documents were immediately accepted at face value. As proof positive of Stalin's guilt, this is closed bracket number 1. But already in 1995, a book had appeared titled The Katyn Mystery, in Russian, Katynsky Detektiv. A book that strung together a number of arguments, some good and some not so good, to try to prove that the Soviets could not have killed the Poles. Now the fat was in the fire. This caused an uproar and attracted a lot of attention to the Katyn issue. 2 websites were eventually created, one anti-Soviet and one pro-Soviet, although the latter site did reprint some anti-Soviet materials too. More books appeared, especially more books arguing that Stalin and the Soviets did not do it. These have been virtually ignored outside Russia, and even inside Russia, they've received little notice. None has been translated. I have studied all of them very carefully. In 2010, Viktor Ilyukhin, a member of the Russian Duma, which is their parliament, from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, claimed that a man had come to him claiming to be one of the forgery team hired to forge closed packet number 1. Ilyukhin produced some very convincing materials that this man had given to him. Photographs of these materials are available on the web. Naturally, proponents of the official version claimed that these were the forgeries and that closed packet number 1 documents are genuine. That's how things stood until when, between 2010 and 2012, a Polish-Ukrainian archaeology team at work on a mass grave in Volodymyr Volynski, Ukraine, under the assumption that the corpses there had been victims of the Soviet NKVD, found 2 Polish policemen's badges. This is a reproduction of one of them. Okay? The holders of these badges were identified as men who, according to the official version of Katyn, were supposed to have been killed in Tver, Russia, 700 miles away in April and May 1940. So here what we have on the cover is, this is the memorial plaque at the Polish cemetery in Tver, Russia, formerly Kalinin, right? Where 6,200 and something Polish officers killed by the Soviets are supposed to be buried, supposedly. They haven't found the bodies, but that's the story. So every one of those guys has a plaque. This is the plaque of Private Joseph, Constable Joseph Kuligowski. It's a Tver, Russia, and this is one side of a 2-sided badge of his that was found at Volodymyr Volynski, Ukraine, buried in a German mass murder site of 1941. Okay? So that's what gives this excavation at Volodymyr Volynski makes it important. Okay? This is where my 2013 article picked up the story. That article led to this book project to see whether, in fact, the official version, the Soviets are guilty version, really was kaput. After all, except for a very small number of Russians, the whole world claims that the Soviets murdered these 14,000 to 22,000 Poles. And that effort led to this book that I introduce and recommend to you today. So what should you do? Read it, of course. Read it until you yourselves are convinced that the Soviets did not commit the Katyn Massacre. Then publicize it. There are Katyn monuments, Katyn Massacre monuments in several places in the United States. There's a big one in Jersey City, New Jersey. There's one in Los Angeles. I'm not sure exactly where, but some people in Los Angeles told me that there's a monument someplace in some park in Los Angeles. I don't know of one in this area, but there's a Polish consulate at 745 Market Street in San Francisco. You could prepare a leaflet about how the story that the Soviets killed the Polish POWs is a lie, and then picket the Polish consulate and hand out the leaflet. Hey, you can certainly write letters to your local newspapers, especially as April 13th, Katyn Memorial Day, approaches. That was the day in 1943 that the Germans started to claim that the Soviets had done it, right? So that is now a holiday in Poland, right? And all over the world, that's Katyn Memorial Day, right? As that date approaches, you could write letters to your local newspapers. See my article on my webpage entitled Katyn Memorial Day, April 13th is an anti-communist fraud. That's on my webpage, which you can find by Googling. In the real world, the Red Army did not murder the Poles. They liberated the Poles. It was the anti-communist Armia Krajowa, the home army, that murdered Poles. Thousands of communist and Jewish citizens of Poland. These criminals are now honored in Poland, while all the communist parties and even communist symbols are outlawed. It's against the law in Poland to carry the symbol of the hammer and sickle, for example. Against the law. You can spread the word however you can. The Germans, not the Soviets, committed the Katyn Massacre. What's more, all the allegations that Stalin committed crimes and atrocities are false. Anti-Stalinism is based on lies. If we are to build a better, stronger communist movement in the future, We must learn not only from the successes and failures of the communist movement of the 20th century, we must also investigate and dismantle the lies about that movement. These lies show that the world capitalists still fear communism like the plague. They are right to do so. Communism is a deadly threat to all exploiters and racists, and it is what we need today more than ever. Thank you.